Okay, let's talk about fat metabolism part 3. Our first part of practical applications. So, the first practical application I want to discuss is repeated bouts versus long bouts. And if you look here to the left, what we're looking at is non-esterified fatty acids as well as plasma glycerol. So, what you see here is this is non-esterified fatty acids, which is the black, after the first bout of exercise. So you essentially can see that you do about a 60-minute bout of exercise, then you take 60 minutes off, and you do the same 60-minute bout at the same intensity, and voila, you can see that you actually are metabolizing more fat than the first session. And this seems to be explained by elevations in plasma norepinephrine relative to the first bout. So basically what happens is when you do the first bout, norepinephrine raises up in the blood, also other hormones like growth hormone. That seems to create a counter-regulatory response which primes the system to metabolize more fat during the second exercise session. This also might be explained by a lowering of plasma insulin, which is the black here. See insulin during the first session. When we have elevations in epinephrine, that has that counter-regulatory response, which partly has to do with its inhibitory effects on insulin secretion. What this study shows here is you're looking at fatty acid, essentially in the blood, and you're seeing a single bout, which is the white open circles, versus repeated, which is the dark closed circles. Notice that when you do two 30-minute bouts separated by only 20 minutes, it primes the system to metabolize more fat than a single 60-minute straight bout, for reasons previously discussed. Also, in this case, where you only have the 20-minute separation, you basically had the metabolism of fat occurring mainly after the exercise bout had stopped. And you can see that right here. Greater fat metabolism. In fact, it went from 56% elevated compared to 77% when you actually did the repeated bouts. And we also see that BHB levels are higher, which are ketones, which are a really good indication of high rates of fat metabolism. What about when you consume carbohydrates? Here's a study which shows consuming carbohydrates 20 minutes before moderate to high intensity exercise. If you look at RER in the placebo, it's 0.93 to 0.89 to 0.93 from 30 to 120 minutes. If you have carbohydrates 20 minutes before exercise, the RER stays around the same. This indicates that carbohydrates given shortly before exercise does not inhibit fat metabolism. But this is also intensity dependent. So what we're looking at here is if you give carbohydrates 30 minutes after exercise begins and low intensity exercise, we see a separation between fat oxidation, the low fasted group, which is open bars or open circles, versus the low intensity fed condition. However, we look at moderate intensity exercise at the top, we can clearly see that there is no inhibition with the open triangles versus the closed triangles, which are fed. Likely because the moderate intensity exercise ramps up epinephrine, lowers insulin, and creates that counter-regulatory response. So why is lowering insulin important? Well, if we look at insulin, it increases, when you infuse insulin, we see an increase in adipose tissue lipoprotein lipase. So that's inhibited with exercise. And specifically those repeated bouts drastically lower Adipose LPL. And this is another depiction of the study we previously talked about. If you look at plasma insulin levels, when you have carbohydrates 30 minutes after exercise and low intensity exercise, they drastically rise. That's the dark circles. If you look at 68% VO2 max, while the exercising condition without feeding, which is the open triangles, lowers insulin, the fed condition does not increase insulin above basal levels. And you can clearly see that here. If you compare the insulin response during exercise to basal levels, they're not different. Now, what's the effect of intensity on fat metabolism? This is good data at a Utilization lab. And what you're seeing is that moderate intensity exercise, 65% of your VO2 max, maximizes fat oxidation. Okay? And then it decreases thereafter. This is likely because adipose tissue blood flow is optimized to 65% and decreases thereafter. And also, after 65%, you have a greater increase in fast twitch motor unit recruitment, which is a low capacity to oxidize fat. So people often take this to mean that moderate intensity exercise is ideal for long-term fat metabolism. But this may not be the case. So while high intensity exercise does not optimize fat metabolism during exercise, it does alter fat metabolism for up to 40 hours post-exercise. So here you see baseline RER, then 24 hours post-high intensity exercise, then 40 hours post-high intensity exercise. Still, RER is lower, which is indicative of elevated fat metabolism. Also, we see that moderate intensity exercise only has a modest effect on long-term fat loss compared to diet only. That's what you're seeing here. All of these studies are exercise or diet only. And what you can see here, this is the overall effect. Only a moderate, slightly greater decline in fat mass with moderate intensity exercise plus cardio. And this may be because long-term moderate intensity cardio decreases gains of muscle in a dose-dependent fashion, as we showed in our study here. We see that lower body hypertrophy, lower body strength and power decline in a dose-dependent fashion. And we know that is important for long-term metabolism. So that's the fat burning zone we discussed. But we actually tested in this study long-term fat loss with the fat burning zone, which is 60 to 70% VO2 max, compared to 90 to 100% or greater. We see the greatest fat loss in the high intensity condition. And other studies such as TRAPS lab agrees with this. We see change in fat mass in HIEE, which is high intensity, versus steady state, moderate intensity exercise. We see that the high intensity results in greater fat loss than the steady state exercise. We also see the same thing looking at adipose tissue. We see high intensity is more advantageous for central abdominal adipose compared to the steady state. And as many of you have seen this video before, these are how we actually do these high intensity intervals in our lab. These Wingate protocols here. We typically end up doing anywhere from 6 to 30-second all-out sprint bouts, and subjects typically perform Wingate tests from 4 to 10 times, separated by 4 minutes of recovery. So besides doing like 10 to 30-second bouts with 4 minutes of recovery, in our lab, as well as others, a protocol has been to perform 10 6-second sprints with 30 seconds rest between sprints, which is what we're seeing here. One thing you notice when you do those 10 30-second sprints, you get a large increase in adrenaline, therefore a long-term fat metabolism capacity. We also see here that 30-second sprints and 10-second sprints result in greater VO2 maxes. In fact, if you do 30 and 10-second sprints, both of them end up increasing VO2 max by about 9%, compared to 10-second sprints with 2 minutes rest, which is only 4%. Basically, what's going on here is that when you have longer rest period lengths, each sprint is higher intensity, you cause a greater decline in skeletal muscle glycogen levels, and therefore trigger greater increases in mitochondrial biogenesis. Remember, mitochondrial biogenesis will occur proportional to the decline in energy status of the cell. Here we see here, basically we have SIT, which is the interval training, versus the typical endurance training. We're looking at PGC1 alpha, which is the master regulator of mitochondrial biogenesis. We see greater increases, or at least the same increases, with the high intensity interval versus the endurance training. So this seems to be great for mitochondrial biogenesis as well. Now, what I want to point out is that most people think sprints are only anaerobic, but that's not the case. So what we see here, if you look at glycolysis percent derived from anaerobic energy on the first 30-second sprint, we see that 55% of total ATP energy is provided by anaerobic glycolysis. But by the third sprint, 63% of glycolysis derived ATP is generated by aerobic energy system. We also know that interval training increases essentially the enzymes responsible for fat metabolism. We see pre versus post with BHAD and citrate synthase. And if you do 60% of your VO2 max post-training versus pre-training, you can see that total fat oxidation is greater following the interval. So we are adapted to utilize fat during any form of exercise or movement following interval exercise. What about performance? You're interested in body composition, but also interested in performance. We performed this study where we did 5 weeks of 4 to 10 repetitions of 10 to 30 second Wingates, or 45 to 60 minutes of moderate intensity cycling at moderate intensity heart rate. We did on-ice drills, such as essentially goal line to blue line. If you look at the gray, which is interval, they shaved off more time from goal line to blue line on both that as well as suicides. So essentially on-ice performance was improved with the interval versus the steady state. And if you look at muscle thickness, which is the gray is interval and the black is continuous, you see muscle thickness went up in the interval and down in the continuous, which again is why we think that long-term interval is going to be better for metabolic rate and overall fat metabolism. But even if you're insistent on doing moderate intensity exercise, if you see the slashed line there, you're looking at fat oxidation, if you look at the open bar, you're looking at fat oxidation with no interval. If you look at the black bar, you're looking at moderate intensity exercise after a 20-minute interval. We see in every single time point, fat oxidation is greater when doing moderate intensity exercise after interval than with no interval. And that is likely because you have a greater counter-regulatory response. One thing I want to point out is never do cardio alone without weights. To your right, what you're seeing is essentially resistance exercise alone in metabolic rate. Second is endurance in metabolic rate. It goes down. Third is resistance exercise plus endurance. It goes up. So if you do endurance training alone, you will lower metabolism in a dose-dependent fashion. So in summary, separating cardio into smaller sessions may be advantageous for fat metabolism. If you must eat carbohydrates, and do so closer or during the exercise session. Interval training is beneficial for fat metabolism, and we recommend 4 to 10, 10 to 30 second all-out sprints, or 10 by 6 all-out sprints separated by 30 seconds. Thank you for your time, and I'll see you on the next issue.